The Silent War, how the United States is using the NDAA to squeeze China's empire. It is no coincidence that the NDAA emerged precisely at the moment when China began to move beyond its long-held role as the world's factory. As Beijing speaks openly about national rejuvenation and a new global order, Washington has chosen not to respond with fiery rhetoric, but with something far more consequential, a carefully engineered legal architecture. The NDAA is the product of this mindset, a worldview that treats economics, technology, and law as the primary battlefields of the 20th century. Every clause is strategic. Every line is a calculated move within a broader design whose objective is not to defeat China outright, but to slow it down, weaken its momentum, and ultimately force it to question the sustainability of its own trajectory.
Welcome to the Cloud News, your destination for dynamic perspectives on economics, technology, and financial investment. From market fluctuations to intriguing social trends, we bring the world to you through in-depth analyses. It's not just news, but a lens to help you understand the world that is shaping today.
When the U.S. House of Representatives approved a record-breaking defense budget, the signal was not aimed solely at Beijing. It was also directed at allies, global markets, and multinational corporations. The United States is prepared to spend heavily to preserve military superiority, but it is equally prepared to redraw the boundaries governing capital flows and technological transfer. American investors must now weigh every dollar entering China not only against market risk, but against legal and political exposure. That recalibration does not stop at U.S. borders. European funds, Japanese banks, and global technology firms are quietly adjusting their strategies to avoid being caught inside an expanding web of regulatory scrutiny. At the military level, U.S.-Japan coordination carries powerful symbolic weight. Joint flights involving American bombers and Japanese fighter jets are not merely acts of deterrence. They reaffirm that regional security remains anchored in alliances and commitments. As China and Russia increase military activity near Japan, the message is blunt and unmistakable. Any attempt to alter the status quo by force will meet a collective response. This is not theatrical posturing. It is part of an integrated strategy, with the NDAA serving as the legal foundation beneath every subsequent action. Running parallel to these measures is the human rights front, often underestimated in strategic analysis, yet deeply influential over time. Congressional events spotlighting human rights abuses in China are not only moral statements, they are narrative instruments. Testimonies from victims and allegations involving religious persecution and forced organ harvesting, however, contested erode Beijing's global standing. In an era where image and legitimacy increasingly translate into soft power, this reputational damage represents a long-term vulnerability that cannot be easily quantified but cannot be ignored. For China, the true challenge lies not in any single measure, but in the convergence of multiple fronts. Investment oversight, technological restrictions, supply chain realignment, and reputational strain accumulate pressure gradually but relentlessly. Beijing may seek to adapt, accelerating technological self-reliance, deepening ties with developing nations, and constructing parallel financial mechanisms. Yet the central question remains unresolved. Can these efforts advance quickly and deeply enough to offset the loss of integration with the Western economic technology ecosystem? Meanwhile, the United States and its allies are advancing cautiously but with consistency. There are no declarations of war, no publicly defined red lines, only continuous policy adjustments, each modest on its own, yet aligned in the same direction. This is a strategy whose impact becomes visible only after years have passed, when the balance has already shifted and the turning point is recognized in hindsight. This is where the silent war becomes most dangerous. Without a dramatic rupture, complacency thrives. Businesses continue operations, markets keep trading, governments keep negotiating while the structural foundations of the global order quietly evolve. The NDAA is not an endpoint. It is the opening chapter of a new era in which law itself becomes a weapon and patience a strategic advantage. And the story does not end here. What we are witnessing is merely the surface of a deeper process, one in which today's decisions will shape the balance of power for decades, and where the real cost of this conflict may only be felt when it is already too late to reverse course. One critical element often overlooked in discussions about the NDAA is that this contest is not confined to Washington and Beijing. It is increasingly forcing the rest of the world to choose sides. As the United States establishes new standards for investment, supply chain security, and technological safety, allies in Europe and Asia find the space for neutrality shrinking. A German manufacturer, a French investment fund, or a Korean technology conglomerate must all confront the same question. Does deeper engagement with China risk placing them at odds with the legal and strategic framework led by the United States? That question itself is the NDAA's real power. In Europe, debates around de-risking rather than full decoupling from China are intensifying. Yet in practice, U.S. regulations are accelerating the process regardless of terminology. Export controls on advanced components, security-based data scrutiny, and investment screening are forcing companies to restructure supply chains. Each restructuring removes another piece from the global integration puzzle China spent decades assembling. Inside China, the pressure is rarely acknowledged openly, but it is evident in policies emphasizing self-reliance. Beijing is pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and new energy technologies in an attempt to break technological containment. Yet technological independence is not merely a matter of funding. It depends on ecosystems, talent flows, open markets, and international trust. When access narrows, learning slows and innovation suffers. At the same time, concerns over espionage and influence operations are gaining prominence in the West. Warnings about honey traps, intellectual property extraction, and pressure on overseas Chinese communities are no longer fringe narratives. They are becoming part of mainstream risk assessment. As trust erodes, transaction costs rise not just financially, but politically and socially. Notably, the United States does not need grand speeches to persuade the world. It sets the rules, and markets and governments adjust accordingly. This approach differs sharply from Cold War-era confrontations. There is no iron curtain, no rigid block division, only invisible barriers that grow thicker over time. These barriers are particularly difficult for China to navigate because they cannot be dismantled by a single decision or bilateral deal. Looking further ahead, the fundamental question is not merely how China responds, but where the global order is heading. If current trends persist, the world may enter a deeply fragmented phase, with technology, finance, and security organized along competing normative blocks. In that scenario, the NDAA is not simply a tool against China, it becomes a hinge upon which a new global order turns, where standards and laws define the true boundaries of power. And here lies the most unsettling aspect, the quietness of the present moment. Trade continues, markets function, diplomacy persists. Yet beneath this apparent normalcy, familiar foundations are shifting. When the impact finally becomes undeniable, the range of available choices may already have narrowed. This silent war does not announce itself. It rewrites the rules line by line, and not everyone will be prepared for the consequences. What ultimately makes the NDAA so potent is not any single restriction, but its ability to induce systemic self-censorship. When U.S. law mandates investment transparency, security risk assessments, and administrative intervention authority, the ripple effects are immediate. Companies do not wait to be banned. They withdraw voluntarily. Funds rebalance portfolios preemptively. Fear of exposure performs the work of enforcement. In this context, military maneuvers serve as backdrop rather than centerpiece. They remind all actors that regulatory frameworks are backed by hard power. When Japan raises alert levels after radar lock-ons, The message is not only for Beijing, it reinforces that the existing order is costly to challenge. On the financial front, China seeks protection through gold accumulation, reserve diversification, and alternative settlement mechanisms. Yet the NDAA strikes deeper, targeting the trust-based infrastructure of global finance. When the United States and its allies dominate payment systems, accounting standards, and compliance regimes, parallel systems face inherent credibility hurdles. Few countries are willing to trade stability for an unproven alternative. Human rights narratives further narrow political room for compromise. Persistent reports of religious repression, forced organ harvesting, and transnational intimidation make policy relaxation difficult for Western lawmakers under public scrutiny. Here, human rights operate not only as moral concerns but as political leverage. Domestically, China responds with tighter information control and heightened adversarial framing, but prolonged confrontation carries costs. Reduced academic exchange, restricted research collaboration, and limited talent mobility gradually weaken innovation capacity. These effects rarely appear immediately in GDP figures, yet they corrode long-term growth. Time itself becomes the decisive variable. The United States is betting it can absorb restructuring costs faster than China can achieve full self-sufficiency. This is a war of endurance, not of dramatic strikes. The winner will be the actor that sustains pressure without exhausting itself. Viewed through this lens, the NDAA resembles an hourglass. Each review cycle, each new standard, lets more sand fall. There is no single decisive moment, only accumulation. And when the shift becomes obvious, it will already be complete. Perhaps the most sobering reality is this. Power in a hyper-connected world no longer rests solely on coercion, but on shaping decision environments. The NDAA is precisely such a tool. No declarations, no overt confrontation, just consistency, patience, and institutional depth. And when history looks back, it may find that the most consequential changes did not occur in moments of crisis, but in processes that felt routine, reasonable, and procedurally correct, right up until there was no way back. Yet beneath all of this, there is a deeper layer that rarely makes headlines, but quietly governs outcomes: expectation. Markets move on expectation. Capital reallocates on expectation. Governments adjust posture based not only on present conditions, but on where they believe risk is heading. And this is where the NDAA exerts its most subtle and perhaps most decisive influence. Once an economy becomes associated with long-term regulatory uncertainty, every forecast tied to it begins to carry an invisible discount. Growth projections are revised downward. Valuations compress. Long-term commitments are postponed. This is not the result of a single sanction or a single ban. It is the cumulative effect of perceived instability in access to technology, to capital, to legal predictability. For China, the danger is not isolation overnight, but gradual marginalization within the most advanced segments of the global economy. This process is already visible in boardrooms and investment committees. Conversations are changing tone. The question is no longer, how much exposure to China should we have? But how much exposure is defensible 5 years from now? That subtle shift matters, because once exposure becomes something that must be justified rather than assumed, momentum reverses. And reversals, once underway, are difficult to stop. For multinational corporations, the strategic calculus has become increasingly complex. Supply chains optimized purely for efficiency are being redesigned around resilience and political risk. Redundancy, once considered wasteful, is now framed as prudence. Production is diversified, not necessarily because China is uncompetitive, but because concentration itself is now seen as a liability. The NDAA did not invent this logic, but it codified it, accelerated it, and gave it institutional backing. This is especially pronounced in sectors that sit at the intersection of civilian and military application: semiconductors, advanced materials, artificial intelligence, aerospace components. In these areas, ambiguity itself becomes unacceptable. Firms cannot afford to operate in regulatory gray zones where a single policy shift could freeze assets, void contracts, or trigger compliance violations. The result is a quiet but persistent reorientation away from dependence, even in the absence of formal prohibitions. From Beijing's perspective, this is a uniquely frustrating dynamic. There is no single lever to pull, no negotiation that can fully restore confidence once doubt has set in. Even goodwill gestures struggle to gain traction when the underlying framework remains unchanged. And because the NDAA is embedded within U.S. law rather than executive discretion, its durability becomes part of the problem. Investors and governments assume continuity, regardless of election cycles. Meanwhile, Washington benefits from something rarely acknowledged explicitly: structural patience. The United States does not need immediate results. It does not need China's growth to collapse or its system to fail. It only needs relative positioning to improve over time. In strategic competition, slowing a rival can be just as effective as advancing oneself, especially when the slowdown compounds year after year. This patience is reinforced by alliance architecture. Costs are shared, adjustments are distributed. No single economy bears the full burden of transition. Contrast this with a centralized system, where the state absorbs much of the shock. Over time, that difference matters because endurance, not intensity, determines outcomes in long contests. There is also a psychological dimension that deserves attention. For decades, global integration with China was framed as inevitable. That narrative shaped decisions across governments, corporations, and academia. The NDAA challenges that assumption. It introduces the idea that integration is conditional and reversible. Once inevitability disappears, optionality returns. And optionality favors those with more alternatives. At the same time, the narrative environment in the West is shifting. China is increasingly discussed not simply as a competitor, but as a systemic risk. This framing does not require consensus on intent. It does not depend on proving hostility. It rests on vulnerability, and when vulnerability becomes the lens, precaution becomes policy. This has consequences beyond economics. Academic collaboration, cultural exchange, and scientific cooperation are all affected by heightened scrutiny. Projects once evaluated on merit alone now undergo security review. Talent mobility slows. Trust becomes selective. These are not dramatic ruptures, they are frictions. But friction, applied consistently, reduces velocity. And reduced velocity, over time, alters trajectories. What makes this moment particularly complex is that none of these shifts require confrontation. They unfold within normal procedures, compliance reviews, and risk assessments. Everything appears orderly, rational, lawful. And that is precisely why the transformation is so difficult to contest. There is no single act to protest, no clear violation to challenge. Only an environment that feels incrementally less accessible. For the global system, this raises uncomfortable questions. If power is increasingly exercised through standards, compliance regimes, and legal architecture, then sovereignty itself becomes conditional. Participation in high-value networks depends not only on economic capacity, but on alignment with prevailing norms. In such a system, neutrality becomes harder to sustain, not because it is forbidden, but because it is inefficient. And so the world drifts, not toward a dramatic split, but toward layered segmentation. Different rules for different technologies, different financial pathways for different partners, different levels of trust applied selectively. The result is not collapse, but complexity. A system harder to navigate, more expensive to operate, and less forgiving of miscalculation. At this stage, the most consequential decisions are not being made in press conferences or summits. They are being made quietly in internal memos, compliance meetings, and risk models. Each decision small, each choice defensible, but together they form a pattern. And patterns, once established, are what history remembers, not the speeches, not the headlines, but the direction of flow, capital, talent, technology, influence. The NDAA did not create this flow, but it redirected it. And the redirection is still underway. There is a paradox running parallel to everything the NDAA has set in motion, one that is often overlooked but deeply revealing. The more Beijing insists that it is not isolated, the more clearly the global system recognizes how dependent it remains. Each repetition of phrases like self-reliance, dual circulation, and resilience under external pressure unintentionally confirms the existence and weight of that pressure. In the realm of power politics, constant reassurance is rarely a sign of confidence. More often, it is an indicator of strategic unease. At a deeper structural level, the NDAA accomplishes something few policies before it have managed to do. It forces China to spend more simply to maintain its current position rather than to expand it. As external capital and technology become more restricted, Beijing must compensate through massive state-led investment. Yet state investment, while necessary in moments of constraint, is inherently less efficient than market-driven capital over the long term. This dynamic places growing strain on public finances, on the financial system, and ultimately on society itself. It is no coincidence that local government debt and state-owned enterprise liabilities have become increasingly sensitive topics within China's own policy discussions. By contrast, the United States and its allies enjoy a structural advantage in how costs are distributed. Supply chain restructuring may raise short-term prices, but those costs are spread across multiple economies, industries, and time horizons. Open and flexible systems absorb shocks more effectively than centralized ones, where the burden often consolidates at the state level. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is precisely the kind of structural difference the NDAA is designed to exploit. Another factor frequently underestimated is time specifically, time as it shapes public and institutional perception. Gradual measures rarely provoke immediate backlash, but their very gradualism allows new assumptions to solidify. Over time, viewing China as a systemic risk becomes normalized in policy debates and corporate strategy. Once a perception becomes default, reversing it is far more difficult than preventing it from forming in the first place. In military and security terms, the NDAA functions as a bridge between policy and action. Investments in deterrence, regional presence, and cooperation with partners such as Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan are not merely symbolic. They create new realities on the ground, narrowing China's margin for error. As the cost of miscalculation rises, freedom of maneuver shrinks. In long-term strategy, compelling an opponent to act more cautiously is itself a form of victory. None of this guarantees a definitive outcome. History repeatedly demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of large power systems. China may yet identify alternative paths, cultivate new partners, and develop new models to sustain growth and influence. But what cannot be denied is that the NDAA has altered the environment. It has made the road forward narrower, steeper, and more expensive. Perhaps the most sobering insight lies here. In a world obsessed with metrics and quarterly indicators, structural change is often underestimated until it becomes irreversible. The NDAA does not produce an immediate shock. Instead, it reshapes how actors evaluate risk, reward, and the future. When perception changes, behavior follows. And when behavior shifts at sufficient scale, history quietly turns a corner, leaving behind questions whose full meaning may only be understood years later. At this point, the central question no longer belongs exclusively to Washington or Beijing. It belongs to everyone else. When two superpowers redefine the rules, no actor truly remains outside the game. In every major historical power transition, those who believed they could remain perfectly neutral often proved the most exposed and paid the highest price for realizing it too late. Viewed from a distance, the NDAA appears to be a dry legal document. Viewed up close, it signals that the United States has accepted a fundamental reality. The era in which economics and security could be treated as separate domains is over. When technology determines military capability, when supply chains determine crisis resilience, and when capital flows become geopolitical leverage, every economic decision acquires strategic weight. In that context, the NDAA is not a temporary response, but the institutionalization of a new way of thinking, one that places security on equal footing with, or above, short-term economic gain. This shift carries a deeper implication. The world is entering an era of normative blocks, not just military or trade blocks, but blocks defined by law, standards, and risk assessment frameworks. As the United States and its allies consolidate criteria around transparency, security, and human rights, those unwilling or unable to meet them find themselves gradually excluded from the most critical spaces of the global system. This process does not unfold overnight, but once underway, it generates momentum that is extremely difficult to reverse. For China, the challenge is existential in nature. Beijing must not only manage domestic growth, but also sustain international connectivity in an environment increasingly shaped by suspicion. Every outreach effort is scrutinized. Every partnership carries political risk. Even if parallel systems are successfully constructed, questions of scale, credibility, and durability remain unresolved. True systemic power lies not merely in participation numbers, but in depth of trust and acceptance of shared rules. The risks for the United States are real as well. Supply chain restructuring and regulatory tightening impose economic and political costs. Higher prices, trade friction, and global fragmentation are unavoidable side effects. Yet, Washington appears willing to accept these costs, betting that the price paid today is lower than the cost of allowing a rival to define tomorrow's rules. It is a long-term wager, one measured not in election cycles, but in decades of relative positioning. At the deepest level of this story lies an uncomfortable truth. The conflicts that shape world order rarely end in dramatic moments easily remembered by history. More often, they conclude through gradual shifts in choice. An investor declines to commit capital. A company relocates production. A university suspends cooperation. A government adjusts policy. Each decision appears rational, cautious, even mundane, but multiplied thousands or millions of times, these choices create a turning point without a single shot fired. Years from now, analysts may debate which moment marked the true inflection in the global order. There may be louder crises, more visible confrontations, yet it is entirely possible that the NDAA and similar measures will be remembered as the quiet cornerstones laid methodically, persistently of a world more fragmented, more cautious, and less tolerant of strategic ambiguity. And if there is one certainty, it is this. Once the rules change, behaving as though nothing has changed becomes the greatest risk of all. This silent war may be far from over, but it has already progressed too far to return to the starting point. What remains is time, and time, as history repeatedly reminds us, rarely favors those who realize too late that they are standing in the middle of a turning point.